Taking a bleak look at the West's vision for Syria, terrorist-controlled areas are scenes of sectarian brutality, fear, kidnappings, mass murder, collective punishment, and pillaging. The obvious endgame of Western-backed regime change, reports are starting to creep into Western media regarding sweeping atrocities committed by the so-called Syrian rebels. Areas held by the terrorists have become bleak landscapes, says here, both literally and socio-economically, with sectarian extremists running the vast majority of civilians from town and leaving whoever remains in perpetual fear for their lives and utter despair for their futures. I've mentioned this before about how you can see all the before and after pictures and see what they've done to this country. I'll read this first paragraph and then I'll move on. It says, "We were first told that the so-called rebels were fighting for democracy. As the West began to acknowledge that the rebels were in fact sectarian extremists, the narrative shifted to simply fighting to oust Assad, or regime change. However, entire battles have been fought not between the Western-backed terrorists and the Syrian army, but rather between the terrorists and local tribes, Kurdish militias, and virtually anyone who attempts to oppose the invading militants, many of whom are foreigners." Assad says fighters from 23 foreign nationalities or nations are fighting in Syria now. Assad expresses resentment of Lebanon's disassociation policy, considering that a party cannot disassociate itself if it is in the ring of fire, and the fire is approaching it. Goes on, it says, Assad wondered, "I don't get it. What does this policy mean exactly? Does it mean that Lebanon will move from its current location to Africa? And when the Syrian crisis ends, it would return to its normal location?" He stressed the significance of this pan-Arabism sect which we derive our power from. It is a reference in national affairs and has a great effect in this field. So I guess Assad pointed out that after several incidents, they tried to involve it in a sectarian struggle and transform it into a militia. However, Lebanon would only reach stability if the Arabism and nationalism of this dear sect was corroborated. He stressed that Syria is not being dragged to sectarianism. The Syrian society has rather become more cooperative, ideological, and national in confronting the challenges of this crisis. Said they tried hard to provoke sectarian instincts, but they failed in achieving that. He says here that the so-called Free Syrian Army is actually finished. He indicated that many sides have demanded that Syria, at the beginning of the crisis, to put an end to the situation immediately. However, anyone responsible cannot deal with his land and his people in this way, and if we took this action when the picture was still ambiguous, we could have lost some friends. Instead, we got some opponents on our side. Moaz, Khatib, determined to resign, says, "I see screen full of blood." The so-called Syrian National Council's head told he's basically a Western puppet, told the foreign-backed opposition bloc that he was determined to resign, saying he sees a screen full of blood in the future. He basically goes on there and he says that they're not getting enough support from the West. It says it is clear the international community does not mean anything. It only acts according to its own prerogatives. Well, you should have already known that before getting in there. U.S. prepares $130 million of military aid package for Syrian rebels. Secretary of State expected to announce plans for opposition forces and international allies to meet in Istanbul, Turkey. It's funny because he says he wants to bring together the Syrian opposition leadership and their main international allies. I guess that's all the different nationalities from around the world that are fighting as terrorists, and the terrorist aiding, supporting countries like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, United States, and UK. Jordan opens skies for IAF drones flying to Syria. Jordan has opened 2 corridors of its airspace to Israeli Air Force drones seeking to monitor the ongoing conflict in Syria. According to the report, the king made the decision in March during Obama's visit to Jordan. That's when he gave him a bunch of money, and they basically came to terms that they were Jordan was going to be a lapdog for the West. Goes on there, says the unmanned vehicles are carrying out surveillance, but they are also armed and therefore can hit targets anywhere in Syria. We already know that Israel has done that already. Russia warns EU against lifting arms ban on Syria militants. Not very surprising, but Lavrov warned the European Union against lifting an embargo on weapons supply to foreign-backed militants in Syria. So it's interesting because Russia, along with China and other countries, were basically opposed to this arms treaty, right? Arms trade treaty. But it was passed. And the main reason for them, mostly Russia and North Korea, voted against it was because it was basically a one-sided agreement where the West can fund these terrorists for regime change. And of course, they have their own concerted their own concerns about this because it could be used against Russia to support terrorists such as the Chechens, like they do, to create and foment unrest and regime change. So they claim the accord might be used to restrict their access to international weapons market even further. Syria, which is in the midst of basically the invasion by terrorists, is a good example. So Russia wanted the document to ban the supply of arms to non-state actors such as rebels in the recent Arab uprisings. Russia censors EU over decision to ease Syria oil embargo. So they're doing everything out of desperation, I think, as far as the West. Because just recently in the past week, amidst all the Boston hoopla, you had 200 troops, and then we're talking about possible 20,000 troops inside Jordan, and that was confirmed for Syria. Russia has criticized the EU for the decision to ease its sanctions against Syria to assist foreign-backed militants fighting against Assad. My website is Global Government News, ggnonline.com. And on YouTube, my channels are ddarko2012 and ddarko2013. All the headlines and links should be posted in YouTube's video description. All right, next up, 60 Minutes Twitter feed hacked as 48 Hours airs marathon special. It says the official Twitter account of the CBS show 60 Minutes was hacked late Saturday night and suspended for the second time in less than 24 hours, this time by someone posting sympathetic tweets for the Syrian government. It says here, and they were opposing U.S. involvement there. It says both accounts were sold down Sunday, but they confirmed earlier attack. Also, they said that a group calling itself the Syrian Cyber Army took the credit this time in a tweet that originated in Indonesia. So they did a similar attack on NPR, basically saying, who is interesting. Look at this picture. I guess they posted up here. The actual Boston bombers caught on camera, professionals under U.S. regime protection. Hey, bro, where'd your backpack go? So they're talking about these guys. One tweet showed a Photoshop version of the president morphed into Alfred Newman with the quote, "We don't negotiate with terrorists because we are the terrorists." Did a little segue here. Contractors at Boston Marathon stood near bomb and left before detonation, seen across the street after a blast, talking with FBI's bomb squad. Who were they and what were they and the FBI doing? So it appears to be private contractors wearing unmarked matching uniforms operating in unmarked SUVs. The contractor types had moved away from the bomb's location before it detonated. It could be seen just across the street using communication equipment and waiting for similar dress and equipment individuals to show up after the blast. So there you go. And there's one of them right there. Syrian rebels, 500 dead in Damascus suburb offensive. The week-long offensive has rebel factions crying massacre. Yesterday, the pro-rebel Syrian Observatory for Human Rights estimated 80 people were killed in a 5-day Syrian military offensive against the Damascus suburb. Goes on here and it says some claim 250. So today, this Syrian Observatory for Human Rights revised their figures, saying that they can confirm that 109 were killed, but then going on to say that they figure the actual death is around 500, making this one of the deadliest incidents of the, quote, civil war. So, like we said, you can't call it really a civil war, even though this website is, quote, anti-war. They're still going to refer to it as a civil war, but, just going over everything we've gone over, it's what? It's foreign invaders and it's sovereign Syrian people basically fighting foreigners. So it's not really a civil war. They wanted to strike a civil war, a sectarian war, but they didn't get it. Other rebel factions echoed the estimate, basically terming the offensive a crime against humanity. So never mind those guys that got shot at basically execution style that were found on the side of the river. The massacre, it was basically a massacre, and it happened twice. Once in January, and then one again in February or beginning of March. So completely under the radar. West didn't say anything about crimes against humanity or blowing up churches and stuff. Or the chemical attack, right? The big chemical attack that they carried out and killed a bunch of civilians. So, but we know what? The Syrian Human Rights Front is a EU-funded fraud. We've already gone over this. New York Times admits the fraudulent Syrian human rights group is UK-based, a one-man band funded by EU and other European countries. April 21st, we have in Syria kidnappings on the rise as lawlessness spreads. Kidnappings of ordinary Syrians are rising at an alarming rate, a stark sign of the spreading lawlessness in the country after 2 years of war. It says the Syrian opposition and government security forces have been accused of abducting people for sectarian or political motives. People are taken just for the money to release them. Well, then we know what? We know all's fair in love and war. Syrian rebels try kidnapping to fundraise the revolution. Again, these are SAS guys probably inside Syria, white dudes, you know, private contractors as well. But yeah, these rebels are taking advantage of the growing number of kidnappings in Syria to fund their own military operations, their terrorist operations, or they call it funds for the revolution. But the Turkish government is also, military is also involved in kidnappings and abductions and for ransoms, you know, demolishing and stealing ancient artifacts. The rebels take it and sell it. Syrian militants kidnapped two archbishops. Two Orthodox archbishops have been kidnapped by the foreign-sponsored militants in Syria and the northern governorate of Aleppo. Qaradawi thinks Nasra al-Nasra front has done well. The Qatari-based cleric said extremist group fighting the Syrian government, al-Nasra front, has done well, urging the front to abandon a pledge of allegiance to al-Qaeda. Earlier this month, the extremist group pledged allegiance to al-Qaeda leader. The union urged al-Nasra front to leave the issue of rule in the state in Syria until after the liberation, when the people can freely choose an Islamic system or any other system of rule. It says here it warned that the pledge to al-Qaeda only strengthens the Assad regime. Syrian troops and Lebanese Shiite militias attacked rebel-held areas on the two countries' border on Sunday. It says Syrian fighting flares both sides of the Lebanese border. This is based off of the article that we were covering earlier in the beginning of the video. Lebanese figures make surprise visit to Assad. A large number of delegation of around 50 political figures traveled to Syria for talks with Assad. It says here, the visiting delegation was composed of notable pro-Assad figures and parties from all sects. This was the biggest Lebanese delegation to visit Assad since clashes broke out in Syria 2 years ago. It says although Damascus pulled its troops from Lebanon after an almost 29-year presence in the aftermath of the 2005 assassination of former Prime Minister, the Syrian administration still enjoys wide support among the Lebanese, mainly within the March 8th coalition. Hezbollah has declared war on Syrian militants. Says what is happening in Homs is Hezbollah is declaring war, says Joe Sabra said on Monday at a press conference in Istanbul. Hezbollah fighters have crossed the border into Syrian towns and cities. So they've been accused. They accuse Lebanon's Islamic resistance movement Hezbollah of declaring war on militants in the Arab country. The accusation was made by Sabra shortly after he was appointed interim president of the so-called Syrian National Coalition. So he basically took over after this Moaz Khatib stepped down. Syrian army drops U.S.-made balloon near Idlib. So get this. Look at that little high-altitude airship. Although it doesn't look that high altitude. It's probably just smaller, more mobile one. It says Syrian army shot down a balloon carrying U.S.-made spying devices over the northwestern province of Idlib. The balloon was shot by Syrian army in the town of Marat al-Numan, and it says here in the countryside near the Turkish border. It was carrying spying devices, including cameras, adding that the devices were equipped with modern technology, I guess. But, you know, it could be Israeli, who knows. I mean, it wouldn't be far off to speculate that it's Israeli. Why? Because they were just busted having a fake rock with cameras inside monitoring the Russian Navy. So then we have Al-Manar camera shoots Syrian army progress. The Syrian army continued its progress in Qasir countryside on Monday, seizing control over its strategic positions. Recently, the Syrian army has retrieved the town of Abel, which connects the city of Homs, along with seizing control over tunnels that connect the Lebanese borders with the Qasir region and reaching the Damascus-Homs International Highway. So you can check that out. That video. Kerry pushes Turkey-Israel rapprochement. U.S. Secretary of State Kerry on Sunday urged Turkey to speed up and cement an American brokered rapprochement with Israel as he explored with Palestinian officials new ways to relaunch Mideast peace efforts. So they're kind of playing off the false notion that somehow Erdogan is at odds with the Zionists in Israel. Well, the Turkish people might be, but their leaders, they're not. They're just playing the game, kind of like in Jordan. The king. Israel seeks Turkish airbase to enable Iran strike. Netanyahu's national security advisor travels to Ankara in Turkey, offering advanced defense technology in exchange for an airstrike launching platform. So you move down here. And he goes on here, says they're going to discuss compensation for flotilla victims. Yeah, right. He will also be seeking to lay the groundwork for the stationing of Israeli fighter jets at an airbase near Turkey, ahead of a possible strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. So please join me in part 2. This is GGN on Darko. Thank you.